Hi everyone, welcome back to ArtsFest Online. We are kicking off our autumn-winter programme with a webinar on printing and print culture in the Midlands, featuring members of the Centre for Printing History and Culture. Your host for this afternoon is Dr. Malcolm Dick, Director of the Centre for West Midlands History, University of Birmingham. Over to you, Malcolm.
Thank you very much indeed, Claire, and a welcome to everybody to listen to a distinguished group of experts who will be talking about printing and print culture in the Midlands. Just in terms of a little bit of background, I'm, as well as Director of the Centre for West Midlands History at the University of Birmingham, I'm editor of the journal Midland History, which commissioned the special issue of Midland History on printing and print culture in the Midlands. And I'll be acting as Master of Ceremonies throughout the event and taking you through the different presentations and managing the questions. What I will say is that we've got three groups today, which I think you would have noticed on your the material you had via Eventbrite. We've got three groups and we'll be opening up the forum for questions at the end of each group. So there'll be three separate opportunities to ask questions. The presenters are limited to 5 minutes of presentation time. I'll be asking you to pose your questions on the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. I won't be asking you to read out your questions, I'll be asking you essentially to write them down, and then I'll read them out to the questioners at the end. Hopefully there'll be opportunities for follow-up questions, but we'll see how things go as we proceed. I think that's all in terms of the logistics of the day I want to focus upon. I'll thank the University of Wolverhampton for their expert help in setting up the webinar. There are a number of contributors who are associated with the University of Wolverhampton in various ways, but we've got people across academic institutions and people who are independent scholars across the Midlands who are contributing. Right, we'll move on to group one, where we've got two presenters, Dr. John Hinks and Professor Caroline Archer-Paré. I'll introduce John first of all. John is a very distinguished historian of printing and print culture and has written extensively about it. He's an honorary research fellow at Birmingham City University and the University of Birmingham, and he's recently been appointed chair of the National Printing Heritage Committee. John, together with Caroline, was joint guest editor of the special issue of Midland History. So over to you, John.
Right, as you may have worked out, this is a picture of a printing press. It's quite an early representation of a press. I don't know the exact date. There's a verse printed underneath it which you can't see, so I'm going to read it to you in a second. First, let me just say that you can see at the back, in not very good perspective, the compositor choosing the type which will eventually go onto the press at the front, and then the pressman there will pull the lever to make the print. This is the verse. Lo, here the form and figure of the press most livelily objected to thine eye, the worth whereof no tongue can well express, so much it doth and works so readily. For which let's give unto the Lord all praise, that thus hath blessed us in these latter days. Printing, when it was a new technology, was seen as a gift of God, or as a gift of the gods, depending on your point of view. Martin Luther certainly took that view quite literally. He thought that God had invented printing, or had allowed printing to be invented, to help the spread of the Reformation, which indeed it did. And it helped also to spread it more quickly, as it did with the Renaissance and the new scientific ideas. I'm trying to avoid saying scientific revolution because that's a contentious term. But was it a printing revolution, as the American scholar Elizabeth Eisenstein claimed? Next slide, please. In her book, The Printing Revolution in Early Modern Europe. Another picture of a press on the cover there with the inevitable dog. There's always a dog in these printing press pictures. I think maybe they caught the rats before they could eat the paper. I don't really know. Anyway, this book, which came out in 1983, was actually an abridged edition of Eisenstein's monumental work, published slightly earlier in 1979 in 2 volumes, which was called The Printing Press as an Agent of Change. In many ways, I think that's a better title than The Printing Revolution, because that phrase proved very controversial at the time. Less so now, people have got used to the idea, but at the time it was quite a controversial thing. Eisenstein undoubtedly did overstate her case, and she overemphasised the speed at which the change happened. Printing, of course, emerged in the mid-15th century, but it didn't wipe out manuscript culture overnight, and, as I mentioned, it contributed considerably to the spread of the Reformation, the Renaissance, and the new scientific ideas. But it wasn't all about things like that. It was also about popular culture, and there were popular printed books, chapbooks, ballad sheets, all sorts of popular things as well. Next slide, please. Adrian Johns's book, The Nature of the Book, which came out in 1998, gave a more balanced picture than Eisenstein, perhaps, and argued that the coming of printing was a more fluid and more gradual process than she was suggesting. The cover illustration of this book shows an alchemist at work, surrounded by what could be printed and or manuscript books and papers, probably both, because they did exist side by side for a very long time. The picture reminds us that printing didn't only spread new ideas, it also spread old ideas, out of date and wrong and silly ideas, to be spread as well and to survive longer. So, as with the internet, you can't blame the technology, it's what people do with it that really matters. But printing isn't all about books, as this issue of Midland History demonstrates. There are a lot of other uses of printing. Day-to-day jobbing printing kept most printers going. And it wasn't just about London either, which you might think from reading some of the histories. Jobbing printing, ephemeral things, packaging, labels, posters, tickets, all sorts of little things, kept most printers in business in London and in the provincial towns. Next slide, please. This is the marketplace in Leicester, which is where I've researched printing and the book trade for the last 20 years or so, on and off. This print wasn't printed locally, it came from London, but it was sold by Leicester's first printer, Matthew Unwin, who set up as Leicester's first printer in 1740 or 41, in one of those buildings, but I'm not sure which one of those. Like many printers, Unwin sold many other things too, but it was typical that at that sort of time, the latter half of the 18th century, Leicester had a couple of printers. Other places had more. Nottingham, of a similar size, always seemed to have more printers than Leicester, for some strange reason. Next slide, please. This impressive building is the Assembly Rooms in Leicester, still standing, I'm happy to say. It was built in the 1790s. It was a magnet for the gentry of Leicester and Leicestershire when they came into town for shopping or to attend the quarter sessions or the various other things that the gentry did at that time. This building is where they would go. It was like a gentleman's club. The important thing for us is that opposite the Assembly Rooms was a large and important bookshop, which was run by one of my heroines, in fact the only real heroine of Leicester printing, Anne Ireland. She was an outstanding woman, printer and entrepreneur. She was widowed early in life, and she ran a very extensive and diverse business which she took over from her husband. But what I like is that she chose her location so well, opposite this place where the gentry congregated. So as you can imagine, they would come streaming out of the assembly rooms into Anne Ireland's shop straight across the road, where she sold not just books, but she did high quality printing, bookbinding. She sold fashionable things like musical instruments, sheet music, magazines from London, newspapers, etc., etc. Anne Ireland was not typical. Most women in the book trade and printing trade were invisible to the historical record because they were working alongside their husbands, so you don't get to hear about them, sadly. But Anne Ireland really was very outstanding. So by the middle of the 18th century, printing had become an important part of life in most English provincial towns, certainly here in the Midlands as in the rest of the country. Many of the printers did other things. They sold fancy goods, they provided other services. Many of them produced a newspaper, as did some of the Leicester ones later in the 18th century. So was the coming of printing a revolution? Well, I think you have to decide that for yourselves. I certainly wouldn't argue against it, although it obviously depends very much on how you define revolution. But I think that this issue of Midland history will give you a lot of different angles on the history of printing in our region, and I think it might help you to decide whether the coming of printing was really a revolution or not. That's it. Thank you.
John, thank you very much indeed. I'd like, after John's presentation, to move into our second one. Professor Caroline Archipare is well known, I think, to many of us on this webinar. Caroline is Professor of Typography at Birmingham City University and co-chair of the Centre for Printing History and Culture with me. She's also reviews editor of the journal Midland History and joint editor of the special issue together with John. Caroline will be presenting on two occasions this afternoon. The first presentation will be on Places, Spaces and the Printing Press, Trade Interactions in Birmingham. Caroline, over to you.
Thank you, Malcolm. I'm going to give a sort of a preamble to how my chapter came about, really. As printing historians, we often compartmentalise our subject, and because many of its chroniclers have come from inside the trade, this has further encouraged a segmented approach and a focus on specific aspects, such as the cogs and wheels of the process, the products of the press, or the personalities that made print happen. Because printing history has often been written by those with first-hand experience of the trade, a very detailed narrative of the craft has been produced. But it has also meant that printing history is a self-contained subject, often isolated from other subjects. This has been exacerbated by the nature of the trade itself. Printing is often regarded simply as a service industry, producing goods on demand. However, since its inception, printing has not only borrowed from, but also contributed to, the advancement of industries very different from its own. Next slide, please. I first became interested in the wider reach of printing history during my own doctoral work on the Kynoch press. Kynoch was the in-house printer to ICI Metals Division, Birmingham. During World War II, the press manager, Michael Clapham, developed an alternative way to produce the metal plates, perforated with many thousands of tiny holes, necessary for the reproduction of half-tone images. At the same time, research scientists, also working at ICI Birmingham, were involved in developing Britain's atomic bomb. The project, however, was hampered by a metallurgical challenge: how to separate fissile uranium from its non-explosive isotopes. It was Clapham's experiments with perforated plates that provided the solution and made the atomic bomb possible. I found this particular story fascinating and began thinking about other occasions when printing had contributed to or benefited from the know-how of other trades and how this exchange might have happened. That a printer could become involved in the development of the atomic bomb was the unlikely result of a confluence of time, place, and space, a triumvirate of circumstances which enabled the transfer of skills from the printing industry into a wholly different domain. Being in the right place at the right time is at the root of many other collaborations. Next slide, please. William Caslon, England's first native type founder of any note, was born in 1692 in Cradley, Worcestershire. Originally apprenticed to an engraver of ornamental gun locks and barrels, Caslon later transferred his engraving skills to the production of punches for printing type, adroitly adapting his skills, materials and tools from one industry for the benefit of another. Next slide, please. John Baskerville originally worked as a writing master and then as a manufacturer of Japanware. In his middle years, he became a printer and transferred skills used in his earlier trades for the benefit of his new business. Firstly, applying his understanding of letters, gained as a writing master, to the creation of his typeface. Secondly, reappropriating the techniques used for rolling metal for his Japanware to the manufacture of brass platens for his presses. And finally, his familiarity with properties of pigments and varnishes helped in the manufacture of his printing inks. Next slide, please. But it wasn't just famous names that engaged in knowledge transfer. Most of Birmingham's small, unknown 18th and 19th century printers supplemented their income by offering non-allied trades, usually conducted from the same workshop that housed their printing press. It is not beyond reason that some of the skills, materials, tools and techniques exercised by these multi-skilled, multitasking printers may have been modified and moved between their varying occupation. My article, therefore, considers how, over the course of 3 centuries, Birmingham's printing trade both benefited from and contributed to the progress of other trades. It looks at how the town's urban layout supported the transfer of skills and encouraged industrial interactions, and how industrial districts and manufacturing links drew on regional resources, skills and capital for the advancement of the trade. I suggest a critical study of such industrial interactions might shed new light on the printing trade in particular and its role in the progress of industry in general, thereby enhancing our understanding of the way in which Birmingham and its trades function.
Thank you very much indeed, Caroline. I hope everyone can hear me. Well, John and Caroline were the co-editors, guest editors of the special issue, and both of them provided various broad overviews, although Caroline's focus was specifically on Birmingham and partly about her own journey towards printing history. We've got an opportunity to answer various questions now. I know there was one from Richard Dye. I assume this was directed towards John, although maybe it relates to Caroline's presentation as well. Richard asks, who developed the inks and colouring, which is, of course, a sort of technological question about sort of processes of printing and how the activity took place, developed, and had its prehistory. So, John, this could be a very, very big question with a very big answer, but how would you like to approach that? Who developed the inks and colouring?
Yeah, Johann Gutenberg is credited with inventing all the various aspects of printing in Europe in just before the middle of the 15th century. It had been known in China and in the Far East. Versions of printing had been known, but he invented everything pretty much from scratch, using adapting technology from the local winemaking industry, which is where the press came from, and from other local trades. He was very imaginative and adapted ideas from other applications. So he invented the first inks and so on. Later on, people specialised in producing ink or paper or punches or type or whatever. I mean, Caroline may want to comment on this because she knows more about the technology side of it than I do. So, is Caroline there? We can ask her.
Caroline, who developed the inks and colourings? John's referred to Gutenberg and his contributions. I don't know whether you can apply anything to this sort of British or English context.
I haven't got much more to offer on that. Baskerville had a particular contribution to make to the development of printing inks. Because he used the pigments and the glazes that he was using in his Japanware business to make his inks far glossier and brighter and richer and darker than before, and he was able to do that because the glazes enabled the inks to sit on the surface of the page rather than sink it into the paper as inks had done previously.
Okay, and maybe I can take that a bit further. Richard, if you've got any more questions based on those responses, do come in. We do know how the inks were made, don't we, and what they were created from? Caroline?
Yes. I mean, printing inks, the recipes are known. Obviously depends what period you're looking at as to what pigments and what the recipes were. That does change over time.
Yes. So, what products were used for making the inks then? I know there was soot, wasn't there, and there could be was oak. Was it? Is it? I'm not a specialist in this. Oak gall, were they used?
Possibly, yeah. I mean, history of printing ink isn't kind of my bag, really.
No, okay. But as you said, we know that Baskerville, through his industrial and manufacturing work with Japanware, was used to using various chemicals and colorings in order to add color, including the color black, but also other colors to his Japanware, his sort of enameled metalware objects, and it would be a simple process to transfer them to printing. Okay.
Yes, I think so. I mean, Baskerville doesn't really print in anything other than black. Baskerville wasn't using other colours in any of his books. So he's very much a monochrome printer in that
Yes,
sense.
yes. Other printers used red, didn't they, as well?
There was some use of red
Some use,
fairly
yeah.
early on.
Yeah.
But a lot of what was called rubrication was done by hand initially.
Yeah.
Colour printing didn't really take off until sometime after the invention of printing gets going in the 17th, 18th century. There was a lot of hand colouring of printed images and texts early on,
Okay.
which in a way carries on the tradition of manuscript illumination, of course. There's a lot of continuity between manuscript and print, which is one reason why the printing revolution was such a controversial term.
Thank you very much. If there are no more questions to Caroline and John, and I haven't received any more on the question and answer.
We've just had one come in, Malcolm.
Oh yes, I've got that.
Yeah, we've just had literally 2 come in as we speak.
Yes, that's fine. Okay, Maureen Bell. Moxon has a lot of information about early inks, black and red, and talks about varnish as a medium for Maureen, you've got carting the colour. Carrying, right, yeah. For carrying the colour. So there's a bit more information then. Moxon is one of the historians, isn't he, of the printing industry. You said there's another question. Oh yes, and from Andrew Hobbs. Was early printing seen as a political act? I think again that would be directed towards John in the first instance.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It certainly had a political impact, as well as educational, cultural, all sorts of other impacts as well, religious certainly. I think it was. I mean, just as the reformers of the Reformation period saw printing as a gift from God to help them do what they were doing, I think also politicians, particularly perhaps radical politicians, which I've worked on myself, radical print later in the history of printing, I think they probably saw it as a sort of God-given gift as well, because it enabled them to get their messages around. So, for example, much later in the mid-19th century, the Chartists used print very much. Chartist newspapers, pamphlets, books less so, mainly pamphlets and newspapers, circulated their ideas, their radical political ideas, much more widely and more quickly than could ever have happened before printing was invented. Likewise with religious ideas, going back further back in time, the Lollards arguably failed to do their reforming of religion because they only had manuscript to work with. When the Reformation, the main Reformation came along, they had print, the technology of print. They used the technology of print extensively. Martin Luther, Calvin, all of the main reformers used print very heavily. So yes, it's political as well as all the other things, religious and social and cultural.
Yes, Elizabeth Eisenstein, of course, talks extensively about the links between printing and the Reformation, which you were referring to earlier on, John. That's right. And just to comment on this matter, of course, the state was very interested in controlling printing in all countries where printing took place, both the state and the church, because it was a new mode of communication, which at one level you could see as liberating, and people, as John was saying, were using it for, from the state's point of view or the church's point of view, for subversive purposes. So printing was restricted and controlled, and certainly in England, you had to get a license to establish a printing press, didn't you? And for a very long period of time.
Yes.
So it's political in both senses. The state wants to control something that immediately is out of its control. And of course, somebody who had his or her ideas about how to promote new ways of thinking about state, religion, or society could use printing to disseminate many copies of their ideas. And there's a natural linkage with how we see social media and the internet today.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the answer is yes. And Maureen Bell has added something, more information about Joseph Moxon's mechanical exercises, which provides a sort of valuable detail on technical processes. So that's useful. Caroline, did you want to add anything to the politics that hasn't already been said?
Yeah, unfortunately, everything gets seen as politics. There's way too much of it about. Yeah,
Printing is political.
Printing is a process, and it can be seen as a political act if that's how people wish to see it. And of course, as Malcolm's already said, so many governments, not just in Britain, but most governments at some stage or another have tried to suppress the printing press, to control it, control what people print, who prints, how much they print. So yes, it has always been, it has in its early days always been seen as a threat to stability, to the ability to control the population. But yes, so way too much politics around.
Well, I think it's probably inevitable, and we've got another question from John Townley. Thank you, John. Where did the army of engravers come from? I know, Caroline, that's a question you've been wrestling with in terms of transferable skills, but it's something that probably John might be able to comment upon. Caroline, would you like to begin there? Where did the army of engravers come from?
Yeah, you mean where did they come from originally? As in maybe they came from France, or
okay. Well, I was assuming as the skill as the trade. It would be a new.
Well, so many trades in Birmingham required engravers. So the jewellery trade, of course, required engravers. The gun trade required engravers. And the engravers for the printing industry were drawn predominantly from those two areas. I think it's interesting to note, and one of the things that I do note in my article is that the physical makeup of Birmingham means that the jewellery quarter, as we know, abuts the gun quarter, and the gun quarter abuts what we loosely term the printers quarter, which is Newhall Street. I think it's no coincidence that those three industries occupy pretty much the same area within Birmingham, and therefore the skills of the engravers that were working in the jewellery trade and the gun trade could easily move into the printing trade.
Yes, well, thank you very much. John, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think Caroline summarised that very well. Could I just comment on the previous question? It's awkward going backwards, but you mentioned about the control of printing in this country anyway. It was controlled up until 1695. You couldn't print in the provinces. You could only print in London, Oxford or Cambridge, or a little bit in York under the Archbishop's jurisdiction. That was all lifted. Those restrictions were lifted in 1695 when the government decided not to renew the Printing Licensing Act, which is when provincial printing really started to happen. But it didn't happen quickly. It was quite a gradual process, and it's not until the middle of the 18th century that you get printers in most or all significant English provincial towns. Just thought I'd throw that in, but no, I can't add anything useful on the engravers.
No, well, one of the interesting things is to look more deeply at apprenticeships and the transference of skills at an early stage, and how this took place, and the linkage between different industries where there are sort of common skills, as engraving is a very, very interesting one.
There's also, Malcolm, if I can just throw in a point here. You mentioned apprenticeships. The difference between the old incorporated towns, like Leicester, for example, which had a formal system of freedom and apprenticeship. You couldn't trade until you'd been made free and paid a fee and appeared before the mayor, etc. In Birmingham, the manorial towns didn't have these restrictions, so which left Birmingham and other industrialising towns free to. You could go and you could practice any trade. You could go. People did go to Birmingham and other Manchester, other places, which hadn't got the old the relics of the old manorial and guild system. So Birmingham was much freer as an environment for people to go and set up in these various trades without having to have a formal apprenticeship or anything like that. So that's quite a big difference, and means that printing developed differently in the two different types of town.
It's a really important point, and maybe that helps to explain some of the innovations that were taking place in Birmingham under John Baskerville and others. I'm conscious of the time, but there's an interesting question from Jeff Pulaski. Are there any known examples of Caslon's engraving work? Caroline, do you want to answer that first? Caroline? Oh, well, John.
Right, yeah, my second slide, which showed the image of the gun, that's the only, that's it. The lock of the musket, that's the only bit of engraving that James Moseley has identified as possibly engraved by William Caslon.
Okay, thank you. I know Jeff and Elaine Mitchell have also made some comments rather than sort of questions about. Jeff made the point, I thought I saw an article in the past saying that an example had been discovered when a gun was taken apart for restoration. Maybe it's a reference to that image. And then Elaine, you've said, production of paper and ink, indeed subject to continual experimentation, as pointed out. It also depended on access to resources of the natural world, cotton, linseed and resin. And there are a number of sources that relate to that. So it's the technology is interesting, and hopefully it can be further explored. Right, I really must move on. So thank you very much indeed, John and Caroline, for your contributions. And we will move on to group 2, 4 presenters here. The first presenter is Sahar Afshar. Sahar is pursuing a PhD at Birmingham City University on the Gurmukhi script, and is close to finishing, I think, and is supervised by both Caroline and Fiona Ross. Sahar, if we can go over to you.
Yep, thank you, Malcolm. And I'd also just want to say a thank you to all the contributors to this volume. I'm super happy to see my work published alongside such fascinating and important research into print history. And I'd just also like to take a second to thank both of my supervisors, as Malcolm mentioned, Dr. Caroline Archer and Dr. Fiona Ross, because without them, this article would definitely not be what it is, as well as, of course, the editors and everyone behind the Midlands Journal. So my article, as you can see here in the title, it focuses on the Gurmukhi type of Oxford University Press, which is a previously unpublished and, to my knowledge, unresearched part of the history of the Gurmukhi script. So if I could just get the next slide, please. Thank you. So Gurmukhi is a script that's usually used to write the Punjabi language in North India, of which you can see some examples here. On the left side, you can see an image of the script as it usually appears in handwritten manuscripts, and you can see that the scribe's writing tool probably resembled something like a stylus with a blunt nib, and the result of that is strokes that are almost monolinear and don't have a lot of tapering happening. And this is and what does happen is more likely a result of the change pressure of the pen or the bleeding of the ink on paper. And this was the general approach in handwritten Gurmukhi. And when missionaries arrived in the Indian Punjab, this is the style that they started to replicate in their printing types and their Gurmukhi fonts. So if you look at the image on the right side of the screen, this is a translation of Genesis printed by the Ludhiana Missionary Press circa 1850. And it has the same sort of look to it, where you can see that there isn't a lot of contrast happening and everything tends to have this sort of even strokes to it. So if I could get the next slide, please. Whereas here, and then this sort of approach that the Ludhiana Mission Press had was something that was replicated again and again for a very long time until 1877, when Oxford University Press published the Gospel according to St. John and their Gurmukhi type, which you can see on the left side here. On the right side, again, you get the same images from the previous page, just for comparison's sake. So here you can clearly see that on the left side, the Oxford University Press Gurmukhi has a lot of contrast happening in the strokes, meaning you can distinctly pick out thin strokes versus heavier strokes, and you can sort of understand the logic of a pen movement happening here. And this was a big departure, as I said, from what had happened before. So if I could get the next slide, please. The research into the reasoning behind the unique shaping of the letters in OUP Gurmukhi was heavily reliant on primary resources in the archives of OUP in Oxford. The material, this primary material was made up mostly of letters, an example of which you can see here, all handwritten, about 150 of these letters, and then the printing types themselves. And I accompanied these with the printed output, the St. John's Gospel, which is in the British Library. Well, they keep one volume of it in the British Library. And I would then cross-check, well, first of all, there was a lot, I had to spend a lot of time sort of trying to decipher this mid-19th century handwriting, and then analyze the contents against secondary literature and the other resources to sort of be able to trace the history of the production of this Gurmukhi font. So if I could get the next slide, please. So the entire process that went through this was is something that I've documented in the article, but one thing that was very important to me was to try and figure out why this unique look suddenly appeared in this font, and what were the design decisions behind it and where they came from. And there are quite a few of these. So just to have an example here, one such example was the introduction of what was described as initial and final pieces. I first came across a mention of these in one of the many letters I was going through for this research, and you can see the image of this in the center on the top row, where I've sort of drawn a square around it. And then on the left side of that, you can see an image of the types themselves. And here you can see that the sort of connecting top bar that exists in all of the letters on the left and right side, they're all cut off in a blunt cut. Whereas if you look at the image on the top row on the very right, I've again marked the ending of the word group. There are these sort of what we would refer to as instrokes and outstrokes in the letters. So these are those initial and final pieces that's being discussed in the letter. And the logic there is that because they really wanted this high contrast, calligraphic and elegant look, they wanted to create the sort of effect that you get when you put a calligraphic pen on paper, and then the same sort of effect you get when you lifted it off. You sort of leave a mark of the angle of your calligraphy nib. And because it would have been very tedious to include this in all the letters, because you would either end up with a lot of awkward space, or you would need to do a lot of kerning to compensate for that white space. So what they did instead was they introduced these initial and final pieces as separate sorts that could be added on top to the beginning or ending of each and ending of each word to create this desired effect. And it's an elegant solution, and it's interesting because there are very few examples of things like this being done in other fonts of Gurmukhi. So these details and innovations that were used here, it's something of a somehow missed opportunity that it was lost for quite a long time, and it sets it apart from other fonts. So I've explained all of these sorts of features, these different features in the article. So hopefully this brief intro will have piqued your interest to go and read more. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Saha. I will come back to your sort of innovative research, hopefully in the questions. But it was a great article in the magazine, in the journal. Caroline, if we can move on to you for your second presentation.
Yep, of course.
On the Baskerville punches.
Indeed. So in my earlier talk, I mentioned how printing history is often compartmentalized and highly specialized. The same might be said for its chroniclers. Printing history has for a long time been the exclusive domain of the printing historian, and has been a resistance to engaging with other disciplines. One of the driving principles of the Centre for Printing History and Culture, however, is to encourage interdisciplinary, cross-institutional collaborations with the subject. So I'm a printing historian, and I approach the subject from the perspective of a typographic practitioner. I'm neither a historian by education nor a scholar by design. I've learnt the ways of the academic historian simply by working in collaboration with others. Next slide, please. So my current research interest is John Baskerville, an 18th century Birmingham printer and entrepreneur, an Enlightenment figure with a worldwide reputation who changed the course of type design. Until recently, Baskerville has simply been viewed as a man of print, but over the past few years, I've been working with Malcolm, who's a proper historian, and others to reappraise Baskerville, placing him against the wider significance of the Enlightenment, industrialization and consumer culture, and reevaluating Baskerville's role in economic, social and cultural history. I found working with others has been a very positive experience, and I now appreciate the benefits that arise from collaboration and how it can lead to a more holistic interpretation of a subject. Next slide, please. Punch cutting is one aspect of Baskerville's work that particularly interests me. 18th century punch cutting was not only difficult to execute, it was also difficult to document. Therefore, knowledge of early typographic practices is generally limited. Fortunately, Baskerville's punches still survive and are housed in the historical printing room in the University Library, Cambridge. They're primary evidence of craftsmanship and provide a direct link back to Baskerville's workshop. But to fully understand the punches requires collaboration with experts in other fields. In 2019, thanks to the generosity of History West Midlands, a small pilot project was established to undertake preliminary investigations into the Baskerville punches. The project was a collaboration between the Centre for Printing History and Culture, the Centre for Digital Design and Manufacturing in the School of Jewellery at Birmingham City University, the Digital Content Unit at the University of Cambridge, and the Birmingham Assay Office. The partnership brought together experts from different institutions and disciplines, each with their own methodological approaches. The participants comprised historians, technicians, and makers working in the areas of craft, digital humanities, jewellery, metallurgy, material culture, printing, and typography. Collectively, their theoretical and practical expertise has underpinned the development of an original methodology which will allow a detailed analysis of the punches and help us understand the practical and material aspects of their manufacture. Next slide, please. This article, written in conjunction with two of my collaborators, Anne-Marie Carey and Keith Adcock, both from the School of Jewellery, presents this pilot project. It describes 4 interconnecting methodologies. Firstly, how reflectance transformation imaging, RTI, was used by the Digital Content Unit at Cambridge to produce high-resolution images of the punches. Secondly, how specialist laser scanning, computer-aided design, and 3-dimensional printing facilities in the School of Jewellery created 3-dimensional replicas of the punches, such as you see here. Thirdly, how X-ray fluorescent technology in the Birmingham Assay Office was used in order to ascertain the material composition of the punches. And fourthly, which was my bit, the creation of an enumerative, descriptive and visual conspectus of each punch, against which the material data can be plotted. This article simply describes the testing and validation of our methodologies. The next step, funding permitting, is to undertake a more extensive examination of the Baskerville punches. Hopefully, this will produce sufficient data from which meaningful results can be extracted, thereby improving our understanding of Baskerville's punch cutting techniques in particular, 18th century typography in general, and adding to the wider discourse of printing history. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Caroline. And I will say about this article, this was showing the importance of how sort of technological investigation can illuminate history. And together with a number of articles in this special issue, people are breaking new grounds, often using new methodologies in order to understand printing history and culture, and using new type of sources. And this presentation, together with Caroline, together with her colleagues, was using new technology, and hopefully more of that can be done in the future. Related to that, if I can move on to our next presenter, Dr. John Grayson. John completed a PhD recently at Birmingham City University on the enamel industry in the West Midlands, and indeed in Bilston, and to some extent in London, Battersea. But also he is a practitioner and someone who has a craft background as well as an academic background. Currently, John is a postdoctoral student at Birmingham City University and an honorary research fellow at the University of Birmingham. And John was also using technology in order to illuminate printed enamel surfaces. So over to you, John.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. I trust you can hear me okay?
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you for such an enlightening first set of speakers already, and it's a privilege to be part of this special edition. I'm basically just going to summarise my article. I'd like to do a little bit of an unashamed plug. I'm trying to set up a research network around this genre of enamels, so if anybody listening out there is interested in participating in the network, then please feel free to email me at the university. The email address is on the slide there. Thank you very much. So the chapter focuses on transfer printing in the enamel trade, a process invented in Birmingham. The trade centred on the South Staffordshire towns of Bilston and Wednesbury, and also the town of Birmingham, and operated from around 1750 to 1830. It produced toys such as patch and snuff boxes, some emblazoned with printed images of new structures such as the Iron Bridge or celebrities and love mottos. Trade also made domestic items such as candlesticks, salts, and tea caddies. The manufacturing process entailed stamping thin copper into the shape of the object and then encapsulating this within an enamel to create a ground coat, which was then decorated with enamel imagery. This could be either painted or printed or a combination. Materials and processes, decorative styles were common to ceramics of the time, particularly porcelain, and then therefore redolent to them. Next slide, please. Through investigation of imperfections on 18th century printed enamel objects in the Wolverhampton Arts and Culture collection, comparative analysis with 18th century technical writing, and material investigation in the craft workshop, my chapter reveals new knowledge of Midland craftsmanship processes deployed and wider trade interactions necessary to create printed enamelware. Transfer print technique is strongly associated with ceramic manufacturing. However, the important role the enamel trade played in its emergence is less well known. The print method was revolutionary at the time and described by industrial tourist Lady Shelburne when visiting the works of John Taylor in 1766. The name of the process hints at the method. A copper plate was engraved with an image, the incisions loaded with ink. This was then printed onto a transferal media, often paper. This was then removed and applied to an enamel surface and fired in a kiln. Transfer printing provided a means to scale up production and importantly created novelty, a factor important to consumers. However, there has been much misunderstanding of the enamel trade, in part due to the limited primary literature on it. Originally, 19th and early 20th century scholars considered high quality enamels, whether printed or painted, originated from the York House works in Battersea in Surrey, which is now in the middle of London. It was a short-lived printing work set up by Stephen Jansen in 1753. The enterprise was significant because it brought together important engravers and printers, Ravenate, Hancock and Brooks. Where the process originated has subsequently been corrected by historians who tracked and attributed its invention to the Midlands through evidence such as Irishman John Brooks' failed painting attempts while he was resident in Birmingham in 1751. Objects in museum enamel collections are extensive and provide a useful source for research. And while the material turn has been deployed by past scholars in helping to write enamel history, their analytical lens appears to have privileged artistry and perfection, particularly around style and technology, when developing theories on attribution of ware to manufacturers. And this has skewed our understanding. Within the chapter, I present a summary of historical technical writing and then shift focus to enamel objects and explain the significance of imperfections created during the manufacturing process and explore and interpret these witness marks of a Midland process. Next slide. First, I consider a snuff box attributed to Battersea, thought to include the engravings of Ravenate. This is considered for two reasons: because of the Birmingham connection of the process, and also to try and understand an important technical description originating from Jacques Brolé, thought, because of his friendship with Ravenate, to have been deployed in Battersea, and so perhaps an account of the process developed by Brooks. In the image, you can see a blurred print and shows the movement of transfer paper during application and an indication of the sequence of the production. On the bankruptcy of York House in 1756, Hancock's knowledge returned with him to the Midlands, where he worked at Worcester Porcelain and for other manufacturers, his images appearing on Midland enamelware. Next slide. Snuff box attributed to Birmingham with the same printed designs are investigated and revealed within the chapter. Irregularities such as these curious parallel lines in the print and the faded imagery on another. Next slide, please. This revealed further unwritten craftsmanship, struggles with application of printed transfer paper on curved surfaces by the craftsman, possible utilisation of different papers for print transfer. Next slide. Having taken the reader on a journey through the texts of the past, objects in museum stores, finally I visit the craft workshop. Clues to craftsmanship drawn from these sources are applied to process replication to further aid understanding. Last slide, please. The chapter concludes by filling important gaps in written technical descriptions of the time. It identifies Midland craftspeople struggling with the new process within the context of batch production. And through understanding the technical parameters of the process, it reveals the importance of close proximity between printers and enamellers, either within the works or the locality. Ultimately, it describes the craftsmanship of an important Midland invention being utilised within the locale of its invention. Thank you.
John, thank you very much. It's a tribute to what is a very extensive range of technical insights that you've provided into the 18th century enamel trade, as well as a specific element on transfer printing. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
We'll move on to our last presenter in this group, and then we'll have questions. David Osbalston, whose talk is on the art of ephemera, typographic innovations of 19th century Midland jobbing printers. David is Deputy Course Leader of Graphic Communication at Birmingham City University and is also completing a PhD on the sans serif in printed ephemera. David, over to you.
Thank you, Malcolm. Good evening. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Firstly, I'd also like to thank Midland History and the editorial team for considering my work for publication, and my PhD supervisors, Dr. Caroline Archer and Jerry Leonardis. During the 19th century, jobbing printers in Britain played an important role in the history of printing. In the skilled hands of the provincial printer, new display types were crafted and composed into forms of advertising, contributing to the education and societal orientation of the emergent middle classes. This talk presents the craft and invention of two influential 19th century jobbing printers of the Midlands, William Josbury, 1838 to 1919, and George Robert Gitton, 1801 to 85. Next slide. Sans serif typefaces were particularly significant in the 19th century. In 1816, the world's first sans serif printing type, 2 lines English Egyptian, was issued by the English type founder William Caslon I, 1780 to 1869. The sans serif was slow to be manufactured by other type founders and did not come into common usage until the mid-19th century. The London type founder Vincent Figgins released a sans serif in 1830, followed by William Thorogood in 1832. By the latter half of the century, the sans serif had taken hold, and there were hundreds of different variants issued by the leading type founders. Next slide, please. Timothy Wotton's Outline Charts of General History, 1848, was printed by William Josbury in Birmingham. He used the early sans serif printing types from the London foundries of Blake and Stevenson and Vincent Figgins. Wotton's charts were inspired by the visual hierarchy found in printed advertising, with their bias for sans serif headings. The charts were forerunners to the educational publishing experiments at the end of the century, when display types were used to enable children, when learning to read and write, to make stronger visual connections through simple letter forms. Next slide. The general use of white space employed in the charts was also a radical departure from the density of information. The charts reflect the open visual hierarchy used in advertising posters in a streamlined presentation of key dates and events. By transforming the compositional structures of advertising into the classroom, Wotton and Josbury were innovators in the field of educational publishing. Next slide, please. Amongst the sans serif typefaces that Josbury deployed in Wotton's educational charts was English two-line sans serifs, a direct descendant of the first ever sans serif. Here, English refers to the size of type, which is equivalent to 28 points. The type was used by Josbury to differentiate between subheadings and historical categories. This is a scarce and early example of sans serif types being used as part of an integrated and considered design across a complete set of educational material, as opposed to being used in isolation as a typographic novelty. It is also rare evidence of Caslon's sans serif types in use. Next slide. Moving to Bridgnorth, George Robert Gitton of Bridgnorth developed his printing skills through his father's press, and from an early age was responsible for printing playbills for the new theatre, Bridgnorth. Gitton was twice made bankrupt, had a weakness for drink, and he was an excellent printer and a well-respected member of Bridgnorth society. His printing made great use of the newly available typefaces by London type founders. In a playbill of 1832 for a production of Sheridan Knowles' The Hunchback at the New Theatre Bridgnorth, Gitton used Caslon and Livermore's 8-line pica condensed, an extremely bold sans serif used for dramatic effect. Next slide. His use of Caslon and Livermore's sans serif was significant on several levels. He was innovative in his use of a heavyweight condensed sans serif as the primary level of visual hierarchy in the playbill. His playbills also had a dual functionality, as they were also used as handbills. And it is of national significance that this is the first known use of Caslon and Livermore's 8-line pica condensed. The typeface was not promoted in their specimen book until 2 years later in 1834. His use of Caslon and Livermore's typeface is evident that Bridgnorth printers were ahead of the typographic fashions, buying the latest types as they were released, pre-ordering from London type foundries. Last slide, please. These two Midland printers, in their radical use of composition and through the application of the latest foundry typefaces, is of great significance. They not only influenced their contemporaries locally and nationally, but they also shaped the work of future generations of printers. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, David, and thank you to all four presenters. We've had a string of questions coming in. Obviously, there's some linkages between the four presentations. They all are looking at the process of printing, punch making, technology, design, all these issues that really get down to the basis of how printing takes place and why, and how things will appear on the printed page. The first question, there's two questions for Saha. If I could put them forward first of all. I think all the speakers should maybe come off mute shortly, but for Saha first of all. First question, which is a specific one, and then another one which is more general. First one from Martin, a specific question. Do we know who cut the Gurmukhi punches for OUP?
No, we don't know the name of the exact individual who did this. In the article, I've stated the names of the people who were directly involved with how the design happened, but the things that I was able to find was that at the end of the day, the production part of this was done through electrotyping, and that was done by what was at the time Stephen Shanks and Sons company. So after the punches were created, then they were developed through Stephen Shanks and Sons. So sadly, no, the name of the individuals directly involved with that part of the process was not something that was ever clearly documented.
Thank you very much indeed. There's a second question for you, Saha, from Andrew Hobbs. How would you summarize the wider significance of your research? That's a sort of broad question that people are asked at their PhD vivas. But
yeah, I wasn't ready for that one yet.
Yes. It's,
well, I think that with something like this, because of the, as I mentioned, the unique features that it has, there were innovations done in the production of this font that could have been used as an inspiration, let's say, for expanding the potential of the Gurmukhi script or other North Indian scripts for that matter in the following years. And even though I think the end result isn't still necessarily the most elegant or beautiful font, there are certainly calligraphic Gurmukhi manuscripts that are much more beautiful, of course, and elegant. But despite that, it does still reflect a rich calligraphic tradition, the final output. And I think for that reason, it is noteworthy for its inventive methods, and it was a development that was worthy of attention. And despite this, it was overlooked in the history of Gurmukhi's typographic development. So in that sense, I think, you know, as people, fonts are still being made, right? Gurmukhi fonts are made, and research always informs practice. So I think that we are working in this continuum, and it's important to know the history of what has come before and why people did the things that they did, and that research then works to inform our current day practice. So in that sense, I think it's very important to add these missing pieces of the history of different the print history of different regions.
yes, and just on that note, it's showing quite a lot about cultural relationships between the British Empire, isn't it? And Oxford University Press is an important sort of institution and communication institution, if you like, and the culture of India, which the British had sort of been engaging with for about 100 years or so. So there's sort of a very interesting sort of cultural and social dimensions as well as the printing side. So thank you very much indeed. There's a question for Caroline from Patrick.
Okay.
And Patrick asks, so it's a long question, or maybe there's two questions here, but has the research of Baskerville punches already revealed whether some are likely of a later date, possibly indicating that the original broke due to use and needed to be replaced by a new version? And then the second part that sort of follows on from that, and if this is the case, can one possibly determine by looking at the metal alloy used, the size, colour, or even the way in which the punch cutter used his tools to engrave the punch, whether possible replacements are from the same period, maker, alloy, etc.? Really deep down technical question.
Thanks, Patrick. Right, I will put a proviso over my answer here. So what we have done so far is really to test to see whether the methodologies themselves work and whether we're going to get any results from implementing the methodologies. And I think the answer to that question is yes, our methodologies have worked. When we were doing the test, we just were working with simply 10 punches, all of which were the lowercase g. It was chosen because the lowercase g is a very distinctive character within Baskerville's typeface. It's also a very complex character for a punch cutter to cut. We can say from the preliminary results of testing the methodology that we can certainly see multiple hands at work in cutting those punches. We can't say for sure who those hands were. We're assuming that some of the punches, of course, were cut in France rather than in the UK, rather than in England or Birmingham, and are therefore later editions. We assume that because Baskerville only printed one book in French in one size, and therefore only one of his sizes required the diacritical characters required for the French language. You find the diacritical characters in all sizes in the punches, so we're assuming those punches will have been cut in France. We can see from the detailed photography that has been done, the detailed scanning that has been produced, that there is a great variation in the quality and standard of the cutting. With all due respect to the French punch cutters, we can perhaps assume that the more accomplished cutting was done in Birmingham by Baskerville and by his assistants. Some of the less capable cutting was probably done in France, and I only say that simply because we know they were produced at a much greater speed. So we think the methodology will, when we apply it to more punches, help us determine at least the number of people who were cutting the punches. The work that we did with the XRF scanning at the assay office, all the punches that were scanned, we got some readings from, and all the punches, we identified 20 different elements within those punches. Because punches are made from steel, the greatest element was predictably iron. However, there were trace elements which were less than 1% of the whole, and it's those trace elements which are the most intriguing. When we get to scan more of the punches and therefore have a greater range of readings, what we're pretty sure that we will be able to do is it will be possible to batch the punches to confirm which of those punches were made together in the same place and at the same time. And it will also allow us to make a comparative analysis which will confirm which were made in Birmingham and which were made in France, and whether there's any sort of difference in the composition and quality of the steel used in the two locations. Although I say we need to do a far greater range to be able to conclusively say anything, but we have the technology, as they say, and once we have the funding, we should be able to take that forward.
Thank you very much, Caroline. That's a very full and precise answer. It just shows you what more work needs to be done on these. Okay, if I can move on to questions to John, and there's a number of these. First of all, from Len Smith. Could I ask John Grayson if he has any idea what somebody would pay to have their location, business or service portrayed on an enamel patch or snuff box? Big question. Say no if you don't know.
I can't give you no. I can't give you a figure, but I could maybe talk about some pointers that could allow people to deduce it, because Angerstein does talk about discounts being given for a dozen boxes, I think it was, and he quotes a price, and I can't remember what that is off the top of my head, but so there might be some little snippets that can kind of quantify a price per unit. The other thing is that the patch box and the snuff box, and let's remember that these kind of were basically the same object. The only difference was one had a mirror in it and the other one didn't. Quite often were emblazoned with images of new pieces of architecture, new structures, so things like the Iron Bridge. There was the next Iron Bridge, I believe, was in Sunderland, so there's quite a few boxes that have got depictions of that. So clearly some of these things were being used as some kind of either giftware or promotional item. So that perhaps points to a direction that they weren't ridiculously expensive if they were, you know, accessible items for people to purchase when they went to spa towns, or, you know, if rich benefactors that had kind of just had a structure built wanted to give it away or sell it as by means of a celebration. So for the kind of small giftware patch boxes, probably at the lower end of the scale, I would guess. Does that answer the question? I'm not sure it does.
Well, I think it does. It's always difficult to find what people pay for these services, and I suppose it would sort of vary. But yeah, when you refer to Angerstein, you're referring to the diaries left by the Swedish visitor.
Yeah, sorry.
To the area in the 1750s, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Really important source into industry and technology. A fantastic source with lots of interesting images as well as text.
Yeah.
To move on to a second question to you, John. Yeah, from John Townley, this is, was all transfer printing on enamel by paper transfer, or was glue-batt transfer used on curved surfaces? I must admit, I'm not really sure what glue-batt transfer is, but presumably you know, John.
Yeah, so there is, so my summary of the article did, you know, I've had to skate over some big sections on it, but there was an important paper to the English Porcelain Circle, which is now called the English Ceramic Circle, so ECC, looking at transfer printing. And they outlined paper transfer printing and then glue-batt. So basically what it is just using a layer of glue as your transfer medium instead of paper, and it's believed that creates a better definition print. Now Paul Holdway, who I think worked at Spode, did some tests for the English Ceramic Circle around transfer printing on ceramics, and some of that knowledge was used to appraise some of the enamel transfers, including ones that were attributed to Battersea as well as the Midlands. Now, initially, the stuff from Battersea, they started to believe that was done using glue-batt because it had a better definition than the stuff that came from the Midlands. But then a later paper, and I apologise because I can't remember the author off the top of my head, but it's all in the article, identifies actually some subtle details which made them then revise it back to paper, to tissue, or, you know, to paper as the transfer medium. So as far as I'm aware, and through the scholarship that's already out there and my own research, it looks like for enamel it was paper, but yeah, it is a little bit opaque, and thought has shifted on that. One of the main reasons I'm pretty certain that it's paper for the Midlands is because the analysis of some of the print irregularities look like folds. There's a discrepancy in the printing that looks like where the paper's creased, which is one of the things that happened in my experiments, and you don't get a clear an image reproduction at that point. And the other reason was, sorry, my brain's just gone.
It's all right.
Yes, it was the parallel lines in the printed surface, which potentially could be texture on the paper being used as a transfer medium, which obviously you wouldn't get if it was a glue-batt, because you'd have poured that onto a flat surface. I've probably got a bit technical there, but yeah.
No, that's fine. There's another question and maybe a couple of comments. Oh yeah, there's a comment by John Mackay, Barry Mackay. Ray glue back transfer, would this be similar to the process used to transfer an image to glass for use in Crystolian production? Well, I don't know whether you can answer that, John.
I'm afraid I don't know, and it's maybe an interesting thing for me to look at.
Yes.
But I couldn't tell you on that. That's a new one for me. So, yeah.
Another question, which is one I've certainly been interested in, this is from B. Clifford. He says, I'm just wondering about the relationship between location and the development of enamelling work. Why Bilston, for instance?
Again, and I think Malcolm, me and you have discussed this in the past.
We have, yes.
There is a bit of a local folktale which does get repeated in some of the literature that started in Bilston because Huguenots settled in the area, and they brought the trade, the knowledge on enamelling over from the continent. But there's been a number of authors who have actually looked into this and as yet haven't actually managed to find any physical evidence to back that up. And also there is plenty of evidence that kind of shows that enamelling on shoe buckles and things like that. So the metalwork and enamel trade looks like it was going on prior to the kind of emergence of the South Staffordshire enamels as we know it. So it looks really as if it's more the different metalworking trades, the small toy trades that were in that area, in effect coming together, and it was just that kind of interconnected trades meeting a market demand and using their knowledge of process to create things that kind of appeal to consumers of the day.
Yes, well, yeah, we have talked about this, and it's really interesting. We've got so many different industries sort of developing significantly around about the same time, and in the area you've got Japanware, which perhaps slightly predates the enamelware. I'm not quite sure, and
but runs concurrently with it, and some of the enamelers were involved in that trade as well. So, yeah, you can. When you look at some of the trade directories, and you've got box makers, buckle makers, mount turners, a whole host of different trades all in that
yes.
Well, I'm going to say small town, but probably for its time, it wasn't actually that small, but yeah, within that area.
Yes, exactly. There's a couple of other comments. Teresa Jones, who's doing a PhD on Worcester, improvement in Worcester. I've been looking at Hancock and his work in Worcester, his grading local history books, and so there's something interesting there. Teresa, it might be useful to get in touch with John and sort of share some ideas. And Richard Dye, amazing linkage between printing and the Industrial Revolution, the development of skill sets and manufacturing processes. All I will say is exactly, there's a lot more that needs to be done on this. Various other comments, but I'll just finish with one question to David from Julia Cunningham. When Caslon first produced his sans serif typeface, was there any criticism, e.g. was it considered lazy, as presumably easier to produce than typefaces with serifs? Criticism either by the printing trade or by the public who are reading it? Question mark?
There was a great deal of, not necessarily hostility, but of negative criticism to the reception of the early sans serifs. In particular with Hansard's work, he refers to the display types in general, and also the sans serif as typographic monstrosities. But it's a double-edged sword, because at the same time it's flipped around to be, the critique is also in praise some of the new techniques which have been brought into typography and letter cutting.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I'm really conscious of the time. We really ought to move on to our final group, which has 3 presenters, but thank you very much, all 4 of you, indeed, for the stimulating talks and for responding to the questions. Okay, group 3. First of all, we've got Dr. Guy Sjogren. Guy recently completed a PhD here at the University of Birmingham on the cut nail trade, and is currently an honorary research fellow at the University of Birmingham. Guy, over to you on proclamation or persuasion promoting the Birmingham cut nail trade.
Thank you, Malcolm. By 1860, the machine cut nail trade was one of the most highly mechanized industries in Birmingham. Yet, despite its undoubted significance, the trade has been largely ignored by historians. Similarly, the question of how wholesale goods, as opposed to consumer goods, were marketed during the 19th century has also been generally overlooked. So rather perversely, the purpose of my article was to examine how the Birmingham cut nail manufacturers used print media to promote their products. Can I have the first slide, please? The central image is the title page of the Handbook for Advertisers. By the time of the Great Exhibition of 1851, this handbook was in its 5th edition, and it was authored, rather tellingly, I feel, by an old advertiser who advised that it was rarely necessary to set out more than a list of the principal articles for sale. In fact, advertisements focused on what I refer to as the 3 Ps, product, producer, and place, as the extract from Piggott's 1818 directory shows. As competition increased after 1830, so cut nail manufacturers found it necessary to shout a bit louder if they were to be heard. L.C. Jenkins did this by using a variety of the large, bold, and eye-catching typefaces that had been developed during the early decades of the 19th century, whilst Britannia's use of a woodblock image of the works suggests that the inclusion of pictorial images was beginning to assume greater importance in attracting customers. Nevertheless, advertisements continued to emphasize the 3 Ps. Can I have the next slide, please? Whilst trade directories continued to form a mainstay of wholesale advertising after the Great Exhibition, qualitative and quantitative changes began to emerge. One significant development was the burgeoning growth of dedicated trade journals, such as the Ironmonger and Metal Trades Advertiser, launched in 1859. Another development was the move towards a more persuasive style of advertising, advertising that carried subliminal messages. On the face of it, this Reynolds advertisement here on the left, placed in 1867, appears to be a traditional 3P advertisement, but it contains what Vance Packard later called the hidden persuaders. Reynolds rightly claimed that he had been awarded the only prize medal for cut nails at the Great Exhibition. The top line of the advertisement was a statement of fact, but its purpose was, however, was to signal uniqueness, distinction, and quality. And here the power of suggestion was clearly being employed to augment the traditional 3P information. The full-page Hadley advertisement over on the right was placed in Martineau and Smith's monthly trade circular in 1876. It is noticeably less wordy than the Reynolds advertisement and relies heavily on the persuasive power of sophisticated and eye-catching graphics. Next slide, please. As John Reynolds found out in 1851, there was marketing value to be had from exhibiting at international trade fairs. 26 of which were held between 1852 and 1900. But it wasn't just winning medals that was important. Of equal value was the free publicity to be had from positive newspaper reports. Although newspapers had never been appropriate places for on-page advertisements, press reports could reflect positively on manufacturers. Here, the readers of the Birmingham Post were informed that John Parks of Smethwick had produced an effective display, and that Reynolds had gone to considerable trouble in fitting up an elaborate showcase. Marketing at an international level was also achieved by entries in exhibition catalogues, such as this Hadley's entry in the catalogue for the 1883 Calcutta exhibition. The advertisement shown here appeared in the Ironmonger a few weeks after the exhibition closed. As well as trumpeting their success in Calcutta, they also stressed the benefits of their products to the prospective customer. Their nails were much lighter than hand-wrought nails and also much lower in price. Even the wording here is significant. Using the word cheaper would have sent the wrong message. It can be argued that the Great Exhibition was a watershed in marketing wholesale goods. Until the 1850s, the advice of the old advertiser appears to have held sway. But during the second half of the century, increasing competition and the need for product differentiation led some manufacturers, although by no means all, to take advantage of new outlets, trade journals and exhibitions, new approaches to advertising, a more persuasive style than a purely proclamatory one, and new techniques in printing and design. Just how effective all this advertising was is still open to question. Thank you. Malcolm, you need to be unmuted.
Thank you very much, Guy, and for providing that insight into print culture and its relationship to marketing. Okay, if we can move on to our penultimate speaker, Dr. Andrew Jackson. Andrew's contribution was a collaborative one with 3 other researchers. Andrew is head of research at Barry Grosseteste University in Lincoln, and brings the benefit of being both a historian and a geographer. And Andrew is going to refer to provincial newspapers, sports reporting, and the origins, rise and fall of women's football in Lincolnshire from the 1880s to 1940s. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me okay.
Yes.
Splendid. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Yes, I would very much like to thank Claudia Capacchioni, Elaine Johnson, and Sian Hope Johnson for their contributions. Without their contributions, this research and this article would not have been able to have appeared here. So if I could ask you to move on to the next slide. Thank you. So our article acknowledges the work of Bishop Grosseteste University, Lincoln Central Library and Lincoln Mystery Plays Partnership, and various other organisations and individuals who came together to contribute to a series of public events, including an exhibition celebrating women's football. Our research drew primarily on the provincial newspaper and other periodical holdings of Lincoln Library, supplemented by other regional and national press coverage accessed online, and visual images kindly offered by the National Football Museum, and a selection of other material held in private collections. The exhibition's chronology began with citing early press references to the late 19th century origins of the game, moved on to recognising the significance of women's football during the First World War, and reflected the game's decline from its controversial ban by the Football Association in 1921. We can have the next slide, please. Over the last few decades, and particularly since the turn of the millennium, a set of pioneering sports historians have established a momentum behind exploring the history of women's football. And this article is in part a contribution to that endeavour, but more substantively and distinctively, it takes the provincial newspapers to be its central focus, and how women's football was perceived and portrayed over time, and particularly through the diverse, dynamic and divergent medium of local and regional media reporting. The quest for success that both the local and regional press and the game of football itself found themselves upon through the late 19th and early 20th centuries gave rise to a particular interdependency and mutuality between the game and the press. Both had in common the need for a secure and viable follower base, and their appeal demanded that each display accuracy, focus and style. And the next slide, please. The provincial press could be the harshest of critics or the most adulatory of supporters, and the women's game fell subject to the extremes of both positions. The case for women's football is especially illuminating in terms of the agency of the press. It was an industry that sought to maintain a high and fair-minded sensitivity to the views of its readership, and accordingly had a role to play in promoting a wide range of community cultural activity and expression, and cultivating all that engendered a sense of local pride and collective identity. Equally and paradoxically, its impulse was to rise opportunistically to all that could provoke attention-grabbing, critical, sensationalist and lurid remark, particularly anything status quo unsettling or convention disturbing. Through the decades of development and demise between the 1880s and 1940s, women's football found itself a beneficiary of the former and more earnest of editorial stances, and other times it found itself much pilloried by the latter, put down and put back. And the final slide. The history and historiography of men's football through the use of the provincial press is far from a fitting place to start in terms of determining how to do the history of the women's game. However, if some lessons might be learned from how to approach and how the origins of the men's football debate has been approached through the press, it's in searchingly and systematically deploying the informative and analytical potential of what is far more accessible now press content through particularly British newspapers online, but if with some guardedness and circumspectness with regards to representation and representativeness. Also in appreciating what the substantive and detailed surveying of the local and regional press can lead to in terms of countering, generalising and myth-building tendencies that we tend to find in sport history, and also in understanding and identifying local and regional cultures and agencies in the development of the women's game in the Midlands and elsewhere. Thank you.
Malcolm, you were just on mute again.
Thank you once again, Andrew, for your contribution to an understanding of the relationship between print culture and particular sport and gender issues within that context. Finally, our last contributor, Dr. Jenny Gilbert. Jenny is a PhD graduate of the University of Wolverhampton and currently runs the Black Country Studies Centre, which is a really important link between the University of Wolverhampton, the Black Country Living Museum, and also an honorary research fellow of the University of Birmingham. Jenny, over to you.
Okay, thank you for that, Malcolm, and thank you to Midlands History, ArtsFest and the Centre for Print History and Culture for this opportunity to be part of this event this evening. Also, massive thanks to all of my fellow contributors for their fascinating talks this evening. So in this very brief kind of introduction, I'm going to introduce some of the key themes that I cover in my article in the special edition of Midlands History. And the key subject is the Birmingham clothing and textile wholesale trade, 1900 to 1960, and their use of printed materials. And my focus is on the 4 key wholesale houses that traded in the city during this period, and they were known as the Birmingham Big 4. Next slide, please. So who were the Birmingham Big 4? Well, the term Birmingham Big 4 was coined in the 1935 edition of the wholesale trade publication, The Textile Distributor. A columnist, and I'm guessing he was probably a Brummie, writing under the pseudonym Distributor, celebrated the appointment of J.M. Nicholson of the Birmingham wholesale house, Bell and Nicholson, as a deputy chair of the Wholesale Textile Association. He was the first representative of a provincial house to hold the position, and Distributor speculates that Nicholson's appointment may have helped to reveal the secrets of success amongst the Birmingham Big 4. He wrote, "It is an honour to the provinces, even though, to my mind, a little overdue. Perhaps we shall learn the secret of cooperation, a much hackneyed word amongst the Big 4. At any rate, judging by the profits of the Birmingham houses, there is much the trade could learn from them, if only it would act the part of an interested student." It is also worth pointing out that Distributor does not name these 4 successful companies. It is perhaps the case that these 4 were so, sorry, one moment. It's perhaps the case that these 4 companies were so well known in the trade nationally that they did not need to be named. Readers would just automatically know who they were. So who were the Birmingham Big 4? A 1935 Wholesale Textile Association list of members features only 4 Birmingham wholesalers, and these are on the slide here: Wilkinson and Riddell, Bell and Nicholson, S.C. Larkins and Sons, and R. Lunt and Co. And in the article, I go into a lot more detail about the entwined histories and eventual mergers of these wholesalers that support this composition of the Birmingham Big 4. These 4 companies again dominate when we look at the makeup of various Wholesale Textile Association boards and committees. The heads of Bell and Nicholson, S.C. Larkins, Bell and Nicholson, S.C. Larkins, and Wilkinson and Riddell all served as chairman of the WTA. J.M. Nicholson was elected chair in 1937, W.G. Riddell was elected to the post in 1949, and G.W. Harwood of S.C. Larkins served from 1961 to 1965. And if you begin to look at the printed material that survives in archives attached to museum collections, and in particular Walsall Leather Museum's Hudson Shop archive, you soon notice that the volume of catalogues and promotional materials, invoices, picking lists for these 4 companies far outweighs those of any of the other Birmingham wholesale houses. And that also supports the hypothesis that they were the 4 dominant or Big 4 companies in the city. Next slide, please, Claire. Throughout the 20th century, the Birmingham Big 4 operated within a clearly defined territory of the city centre. Their warehouses formed a clear hub on the streets around Snow Hill Station that extended to Old Square to the northeast and Cannon Street to the west. Their clustering around the key rail terminus in and out of the Black Country was logical. It allowed for the easy transportation to and from their warehouses, whilst being handily located for retailers visiting from beyond the city centre. Located closely together and trading in broadly similar products, the Big 4 maintained distinct identities and specialisms. Wilkinson and Riddell were known for their ladies' fashions. S.C. Larkin were known for their haberdashery, whilst Bell and Nicholson were renowned for their affordable clothing, aprons and overalls. Next slide, please. An indication of the scale and significance of the wholesale houses in Birmingham city centre can be seen in this image. It's taken from the 1935 edition of the Wilkinson and Riddell Diary and Accounts book, and it claims to be the first aerial photograph of central Birmingham taken in 1919. I haven't verified if that is actually true, but it is what it says in the Accounts book. So the Accounts book was published annually and distributed to the shopkeepers who frequented the Birmingham wholesale warehouses. Initially, it would have been a promotional aid, but it was also perhaps as a way to encourage clients to maintain good bookkeeping practices, which would in turn benefit the wholesalers. It contains a wealth of practical info, details of the different departments and buyers, payment terms, carriage fees and delivery details, train and bus details for visiting the warehouses, and instructions for placing orders. I think if you look at this image here, so Wilkinson and Riddell were located on Cherry Street, just sort of around what is today the back of Rackham's, I guess. And you can just see here, when you look at the image closely, how big and just how much of the city centre real estate the wholesale houses occupied. Next slide, please. So also in the article, there's focus on the catalogues. Perhaps the most visually striking are those produced by Wilkinson and Riddell during the 1920s and 1930s. Wilkinson and Riddell worked with the West Bromwich printers W.B. Hill, Shorter and Co., a bespoke print company founded in the 1890s and still trading today, or so I believe. The catalogues were designed to entice shopkeepers to visit the city centre warehouses and perhaps place more impulsive orders when they were met with the tempting mass of goods on display. They also carry promotions for things like the annual shows, or the seasonal shows, sorry, that the wholesale houses would host. So the Whitsuntide show, the Christmas show. And again, these were just another way to hook customers in and increase their custom. I just want to end on this slide from this catalogue from October 1930. It shows a lovely example of how the cover artwork was integrated with the text and tone of the catalogue content. So here we see a cover that features a rain-battered mauve cityscape with daisies blooming below. And it's perhaps a visual metaphor for the text on the first page of the catalogue, which reads, "Trade during September showed an appreciable increase, and we feel sure that better times are ahead for all of us. Daisies and optimism amidst the gloom of tough economic trading." One moment. So the article focuses, as I say, on the catalogues, and it goes into a lot more detail about the content of the catalogues, the design of the catalogues, but also it looks at some of the other forms of kind of print material in a bit more detail as well, and draws on some really rich archival material from Walsall Leather Museum and also from the Wholesale Textile Association archives held by the University of Nottingham. And on that note of sort of daisies, I'd like to end. So next, daisies amidst the gloom, I'd like to end. So my final slide, please. Please do read the full article, and I look forward to any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Jenny. Another way in which looking at print culture can provide a number of significant insights. I will go, I'll start asking various questions. There's a question to Guy from David. Fascinating talk, Guy, wonderful chapter. From your study of advertising in trade directories, did you observe any differences in how printers presented competitor nail manufacturers typographically, or do you feel the composition and typography followed a generic style chosen by the publishers? A very interesting question.
As far as I know, there was especially in the first half of the 19th century, it was the printer that the manufacturer provided the copy and the printer provided the design. So it was left very much in the hands of the printer. I'm just looking at your question again. Yeah, I didn't come across, when I was researching it, individual printers. So I find that rather difficult to answer that question. Yeah, I honestly don't know the answer to the question because I don't know who the printers were.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. Just to go over a slight tangent there, Guy, I know one of your sources was the Ironmonger, and you
Yeah.
had an image of the front page of
Yeah.
of one of the copies of the journal. Would be very interesting to do a comparison about in terms of how different industries and different businesses manifested themselves in advertising, and you've provided a very sort of insightful analysis there in your own particular area of investigation.
Yeah, yes, I think there was tended to be with the Ironmonger, there tended to be a similarity, a generic form of graphics, certainly, whether it was sort of pots and pans or agricultural implements or nail manufacture. But there was certainly a transformation in the sophistication of the graphics. And there's one I haven't shown you, but it's actually in the article, the last graphic that I've shown, last figure of the Hadley nails. And I just think that Hadley was the top advertiser.
Yes, thank you very much indeed, Guy. Thank you. There's a question for Andrew. Were there any regional differences in attitudes to women's football? That's from Andrew Hobbs. Andrew, that's moving beyond your focus upon Lincolnshire, but are you able to offer any insights to that?
Yes, thank you, and thank you for the question, Andrew. A very interesting one, and a lovely research area. If I could get to that, I would say two things about it, speculatively, I suppose, is that one, clearly in certain areas where women's football was strong and fairly well regarded, and there was some quite, in a sense, famous teams, most notably Preston, Doncaster, for good examples. I expect there was some positive and favourable press. And then the other thing I would also expect is that it depends very much on the broader position of papers. So particularly when you had towns and cities where there were a number of provincial newspaper titles, some would have given more regard to covering the press and the women's game more than others. And also clearly at certain times around the First World War, there was a general favourable opinion. But no, the exhibition was really about pulling out the discourse, and around the country we picked up various examples as well as locally, but we wouldn't pretend to say that we were able to tease out differences in terms of local and regional variation.
Thank you very much indeed, Andrew. A question for you, Jenny. You were referring to these sort of specific firms that had a sort of a commonality in terms of what they tended to hold in their sort of wholesale departments and so on. I was interested. I think it was one of them. I just can't remember its name now. The firm that Wilkinson and yeah, and the other one. They have a registered trademark which has looks like a greyhound.
Yeah, so that is, I believe, so it's either, now off the top of my head I can't remember whether it was Wilkinson or Riddell's. It was Nikini, their prize-winning greyhound. And it was kind of at a time, I suppose in some ways, where branding and logo design was in its infancy. So their choice for a logo for the company, he liked his dog, Nikini, so she became the logo for the company. He also liked pointer breed dogs as well. So when they launched a line of women's hosiery, that was pointer brand as well. So I think it was, they like dogs, so they use them as their logos. But you also see, so Bell and Nicholson with Bell, they used a winged bell as their logo. Whilst SC Larkin had this lovely lark in flight, so a bird in flight with the word still soaring accompanying it. And when you look through Walsall Museum's Hodson Shop collection, you can see these logos on labels as well, on actual garments. So it's really useful for dress historians that we can then trace garments back through to individual wholesalers and kind of get more precise dates on them as well, whilst cross-referencing with catalogues.
Yes, it's really interesting what images are being conveyed by these trademarks, isn't it? And we're drawing very closely to an end. Are there any more questions to the three speakers? And none have appeared. I'd like to just summarise before Claire comes back in with a number of comments. I'd like to thank all the presenters, and I hope the presentations have encouraged you to go to the online version of the journal and to see exactly the different ways in which the contributors have provided an insight into the history of printing and print culture in the Midlands, using the one geographical area to provide a whole series of sort of cultural, socio-historical, print culture and technological insights and how they interweave. I think it's very much a pioneering production, which I hope will have an impact beyond the field of Midland history and the field of printing history and culture. So thank you very much to everyone who's been involved. And also thank you very much to the University of Wolverhampton and to Claire Buckerfield for her ability and her team in organising the event. Over to you, Claire.
Oh, thanks very much, Malcolm. Just to round off, thank you to all of our speakers this evening, and of course to you, Malcolm, for hosting and pulling everything together, and to all of you at home for watching. Just want to say that our next ArtsFest Online event will be Thursday, the 8th of October, with writer R.M. Francis, and he will be giving a talk and workshop on Black Country geopoetics. This can be booked through Eventbrite, and we'll see you all soon. Bye.
Bye-bye, thank you.